Good morning. I'd like to echo William in saying it has more emphasis now when I say it's nice to see everyone here. Even on Guernsey, it feels unusual to be able to hold such events. Whilst it has been 24 months since our last industry presentation, due to the pandemic, it has definitely felt like in the latter part of that period, we've been operating in dog years, with the last 12 months translating to many years of life experience. Nevertheless, whilst it has felt that way, it is interesting to reflect back on what we have actually seen in terms of risk, both for Guernsey and for our wider environment. Therefore, during this presentation, I am going to cover what we have seen as a regulator during the pandemic in terms of risk, and what changes we have made as a result of this. Following that, Conor will be touching on how we are using data at the Commission and some of the new technologies we are using to further develop our supervisory approaches. At the initial start of the pandemic, except for some very spot-on and aware epidemiologists, including our brilliant Dr. Brink, there was a general lack of awareness of the potential risks of a pandemic and what it could mean for businesses and society as a whole. Whilst risk registers in the 2000s had included bird flu or SARS-type events, these had fallen out of favour and had been replaced with more obvious and pressing risks. However, if we review the history of pandemics, shown in this data from the Bank of England, it is clear that they are much more common than we thought. And indeed, that we have been lucky that this was the first major pandemic in our lifetime. Thankfully, global central banks and governments sprang into action and identified that one of the main impacts following a pandemic was an economic recession. The red lines on this graph show the significant drop in inflation in the 8 years following the start of each pandemic or epidemic. This led to what would become one of the largest interventions in monetary policy ever, with, as William mentioned earlier, extraordinary levels of quantitative easing globally. This meant 450 billion for the UK, compared to the 200 billion following the global financial crisis in 2008. And the US have topped 3 trillion this time around, whilst previously only ever breaking 2. Currently, these actions seem to have done the trick, with a social health crisis not being compounded by a financial one. Indeed, unlike in the 2008 financial crisis, the financial services, especially banks, have helped to absorb and mitigate the risk of a financial crisis rather than contributing to it. However, there remains a question of what will happen as all the various support measures are unwound. Inflation is eminently possible, along with further job losses and insolvencies as furlough schemes are paused. There are green shoots of green coming through, as the dip in the level of the UK GDP has not been as great as predicted following the second lockdown. Within Guernsey, we saw a better than expected outcome at the end of 2020, with the predicted shortfall in tax receipts and revenue streams falling to only 5 to 10 million from a forecast of 70 million originally. Indeed, despite all the concerns in 2020, the impact of the pandemic appears to have not have been as great as originally feared. If we look back and consider what was concerning senior management at firms pre-pandemic, it is remarkably similar to the position now. Deloitte carry out a UK CFO survey on a quarterly basis, assessing the risks to business from a variety of factors. If we review the list of top 5 risks that were concerning CFOs, pre- and post-pandemic, we can see that, aside from the first risk factor switching from weak demand in the UK to the effects of COVID-19, there have been no other changes in the remaining top 5 risks. Whilst there may be other less financial risks, such as staff welfare and mental health concerns, that are not necessarily the main focus of the CFO, it does suggest that, on the whole, the main strategic risks for firms are relatively unchanged. So what have we seen from a regulatory perspective in Guernsey? During the pandemic, we took a number of steps to change and amend our supervisory approach, such as delaying the submission of returns and pausing on-site supervisory visits. But we didn't stop monitoring and contacting firms to understand their risks and how they were coping with the impact of the pandemic. Firstly, I would like to thank all the firms we contacted for their cooperation during such a busy and uncertain time. Secondly, what we found from this was that whilst a few firms had initial issues with operationally moving staff to work from home, and that at a certain point on the island you could not buy a laptop for love nor money, that on the whole, firms coped well with the transition to working from home, and that in 2020 we saw a gradual decrease in the main risk factors we assess as part of our supervisory visits. In this graph, the period in which Guernsey was in lockdown is highlighted in green, and it clearly shows a reduction across all risk types from 2019. It is reassuring to note that our financial crime risk remained relatively steady through 2019 and 2020, and we saw a drop in strategy and business model risks. With the latter of these, it could be that firms are focusing much more on the core basics of their business and ensuring that their business survived the pandemic, sticking to their knitting rather than trying to learn to crochet. Interestingly, if we review operational risk as an example, we see a peak at the end of 2019 and then a decrease over the course of 2020. This is contrary to the logical expectation that during a pandemic, with a shift to home working, an increase in cybersecurity risks, less ability to supervise staff directly to make sure controls are working effectively, that operational risks would increase. One explanation for this could be that we visited less firms on site in 2020 and were therefore less able to identify an increase in this risk area. However, we were still reviewing, monitoring, and assessing data and risks at firms through a variety of other means. Another explanation is that whilst operational risk did increase, due to the unusual circumstances everyone was operating in and the short nature of the Guernsey lockdown, everyone was more conscious of these risks and took particular care to mitigate them. In Guernsey, our lockdown was never long enough for bad habits to slip in. A further consideration is whether the fact that we have been locked down on island for the last year has allowed firms and their individual staff more time to focus on these sorts of operational issues and problems, getting round to those tasks which have been on the to-do list for a number of years, but were always being pushed back for something more vital. Therefore, this could have reduced the overall operational risk present. Finally, there is the fact that this only shows a decrease in risk relative to the increase at the end of 2019. This increase was due to a number of visits carried out in the second half of 2019, identifying significant operational risks regarding cybersecurity, integration of firms following mergers, and outsourcing and compliance issues. The same visits also identified heightened governance risk, which we often see go hand in hand with operational risks. In reality, the drop in operational risk is probably a combination of all of these reasons. However, taking a step back, it does provide reassurance that the pandemic did not have a material impact on the main risks within the financial services sector in 2020. In fact, we only set 2 RMP actions directly related to COVID-19 during the course of the year. The other point to note here is that as we shifted and adapted our supervisory approach during the first lockdown, we started looking at our data and firms from a different perspective, taking a more thematic peer group approach for certain prudential risks, such as capital and credit risk. This provided higher quality insights on firms versus looking at them in isolation. Off the back of this, we have developed and adapted our PRISM approach so that there will be less frequent face-to-face meetings for our larger firms with a more straightforward business model. Our firm risk assessments will be more narrowly focused on the individualistic types of risk, such as governance, business model, and strategy, and operational risks. Key prudential and conduct risks will be assessed by focused thematics. These changes have been supported by adaptations to our PRISM system to ensure that we can continue to capture, record, and analyse our findings for further risk analysis and future insights. Whilst we have highlighted so far that there appears to have been minimal impact on risk at our firms, there is also a wider question of the impact to the level of financial services business that is carried out within the bailiwick of Guernsey. Whilst the regulator does not see everything that occurs in financial services in Guernsey, as we are almost entirely focused on regulated activity, it was again reassuring to note that our overall application figures held up well during 2020. Whilst we did see some quieter periods as people were adjusting to lockdown, they were only short. And in the second lockdown this year, we didn't see a pause at all. Now, whilst our figures also include things that are not necessarily new business, for example, of change of controller, it does give a good indication that new business for Guernsey has held up well during an unusual and challenging year. There remains a question of whether this will continue, with the lockdowns carrying on worldwide, if not in Guernsey. But from all indications, the start of 2020 has carried on that positive theme. Before I leave the subject of risk, however, I wanted to touch on what future risks we might see. Interestingly, the only financial risk that makes it into the World Economic Forum's top 10 list is the potential for a debt crisis. This is not unsurprising, considering my earlier comments about the level of economic and monetary policy support that's been provided over the last year. However, a number of the other risks that make it onto the list provide not only dangers, but also opportunities for financial services. For example, climate action failure is one area in which financial services and Guernsey could play a key supporting role in mitigating risk by facilitating the investment and developments that are needed to support the world in moving to a carbon neutral position. Before I hand over to Conor, I just wanted to mention some of the changes that have been occurring within our systems. As those of you who have read the fascinating document, which is our annual report and accounts, will have noted, since 2018, we have been running a 3-year business plan with a number of internal projects to improve our back office systems and processes. One of these was to replace the technology behind our online submissions and PQ portals, as the previous software had become unsupported. I am extremely happy to say that this project has now been completed, and hopefully regular users of the portals might have seen some of the benefits that have come from the change, such as a single sign-on process and an improved user experience. This has been a significant project, and I would like to thank everyone within the Commission who has been involved with or supported it. However, now to hear from Conor on how we are using the data that you are submitting.
Thank you, Katherine. Now, carrying on from what Katherine has just outlined, over the last year, we have continued to work on our Augmented Intelligence projects and to enhance our SupTech or supervisory technology alongside our more traditional PRISM system by creating 2 new internally developed tools, one called Compass and one called Comet. Now, those keen-eyed and eared among you will notice the uncanny link between the first 2 letters of these names and my own initials. Obviously, this is purely coincidental and is no way subtly linked to my own self-promotion. That said, I will now take a few moments to outline at a high level both of these tools and our ideas for the future. The first, Compass. It utilizes a machine learning algorithm, in essence an artificial neural network, to identify higher risk funds based on information submitted to us and takes into account key supervisory judgments. This approach has a number of benefits for us by providing a systematic way of identifying higher risk funds and by reducing the time lag between data being submitted to us and taking appropriate supervisory actions. It also provides a good starting point for supervisors to understand the risk profile of a new fund. Alongside this tool, we are continuing our efforts, with some degree of success, to develop a system to automatically analyze external auditor reports and management letters using artificial tools such as natural language processing techniques. We, like a number of other financial regulators worldwide, recognize the rich vein of information contained within the unstructured text of these documents submitted to us, and are developing ways in which we can automatically mine and then efficiently and effectively analyze these important data sources. To this end, we have recently issued guidance relating to the quality of scanned documents submitted to us via the online services portals under the FAQ section of each. So if you haven't seen this guidance yet, it may well be worth familiarizing yourself with it. The second tool is called Comet, and it enables trend analysis of data within banking returns with respect to concentration risk and the prediction of future trends and movements. It combines data from our annual returns together with selected macroeconomic data as part of the analytical model and visualizes the output for supervisors, helping them to identify the wood from the trees, as it were. Both Compass and Comet have been developed, piloted, and tested in-house within the Commission. And in 2021, we will look to further consider how they could be expanded to include additional data sets and sectors within the analysis. An obvious example would be to consider how these tools could be adapted and applied to help with financial crime supervision as we lead up to the next Moneyval visit and beyond. Not only that, however, we have ambitions that are more aspirational. Consider an automated document checker that would feed back to potential licensees where an application is missing critical information, or indeed a system that uses augmented intelligence to automatically detect concerning networks within the bailiwick's financial services sector worthy of supervisory investigation. These are the types of ideas that we're exploring further as we look to further enhance our supervisory technology over the coming years. To be clear, however, the aim here is not for these tools to replace our supervisory judgments, but rather carry out the first level data-heavy analysis to enable our supervisors to focus their time and supervisory judgments more productively on key risk areas. These tools should help to ensure that we spend our time focusing on high-risk firms and protecting consumers and investors. I hope that has provided a high-level summary of our direction of travel and how we do and plan to use the data that firms submit to us. And if you have any questions, feel free to come to speak to either myself or Katherine. Thank you.